They mocked the waitress for her looks. Now she's the face of a global fashion brand. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? The air wasn't thick from the heat, it was thick from something else, something heavier. Like the whole place was dipped in molasses and time just moved slower here. Not for everyone though, only for the ones who were allowed to move forward. The rest just sat there, stuck, in the dust-choked alleyways, against peeling walls, in boiling kitchens where even the ceiling fans gave up trying. Gracie's Stop was one of those places, a roadside diner with a faded sign, wobbly plastic stools, and sticky countertops. Nothing special, but it stayed afloat, barely, thanks to a steady stream of truckers, a dirt-cheap menu, and the unspoken rule that no one asks questions, especially not about the waitress, especially not about Esther Mary Hall. Esther was 27. In all that time, she hadn't seen much beyond dying towns, crumpled-up cars, off-brand cigarettes, and the stale air that clung to everything. Her morning started at 5:30. Wash up, pin back her hair, button the washed-out pink apron, check if her mother was still breathing, and then walk 27 minutes along the shoulder of the highway to the diner. By 8, the asphalt started to burn through her soles. Not that she needed a thermometer to know it. Inside, the air was a mix of fryer grease, cheap coffee, and bleach. A fan in the corner rattled like it had emphysema. At the counter, the same faces as always. Middle-aged men in sleeveless flannel, old guys with NASCAR caps, and women who only looked at Esther to shoot her a glance full of quiet contempt. They never called her by name. To them, she was honey, girl, sometimes black girl. Most often, they didn't bother with words at all, just lifted a cup and looked right through her. "Fill her up," muttered one of the regulars, a man with sagging jowls and thick sideburns, smelling like beer even at 10 in the morning. He didn't look at her. He looked through her like she was part of the furniture. Esther refilled his mug silently, using both hands to keep it steady. He took a sip, smirked, then said loud enough for the room to hear, "Bitter. Just how I like the owner." A short burst of laughter rolled across the diner, sharp, poisonous. Esther didn't respond. She never did. That was one of the rules. The diner's owner, Mrs. Grace Allison, a tightly wound woman with a pasted-on smile and eyes that judged everything, had made that crystal clear. "People round here are simple, Esther," she once said while wiping down a table, even though that was Esther's job. "They don't want to feel guilty. Just do your work and smile. You do want to keep this job, don't you?" That word, job, meant more than just a paycheck. It meant a roof. It meant medication for her mother. It meant not falling apart completely. And so Esther held on. Day after day, she wiped counters and listened as people talked about her like she wasn't there, like she didn't have ears or skin. Bets on who she was sleeping with, theories on what was wrong with her face. Some said she was ugly, others that she was asking for it. No one saw a person. "Heard if she smiled once, the coffee might actually taste better," chuckled another customer, snapping a photo with a Kodak hidden below the table. He took her picture like she was some curiosity behind glass. That wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. No smartphones back then, but disposable cameras did the trick. Sometimes the photos showed up tacked to the motel corkboard down the road. Sometimes slipped into school lockers. Nobody ever asked. Why would they? It's easy to take when you think someone doesn't have a voice to say no. When Esther went home, if you could call it that, it was to a rusting trailer slumped like a drunk under its own weight. The place smelled of damp towels and off-brand painkillers. Her mother, Rosa Hall, used to be a seamstress. Sharp hands, sharper eyes. Now her hands trembled and her eyes seemed to forget what they were looking for. Esther fed her with a spoon and listened as the woman mumbled names from the past in a half-sleep fog. There was no TV in the trailer, just an old radio. Sometimes it caught ghost stations, murder reports, election noise, riots. But none of those voices ever said her name. None of them spoke about women like her. Recognition wasn't part of the package. Survival was. Esther didn't dream. She had taught herself not to. There were no magazines on her dresser, no posters on the walls like the girls in movies had. She didn't imagine herself on runways in movies or standing in applause. The only thing she let herself do, sometimes, was look in the cracked mirror and hold her gaze just a moment longer than usual. Every now and then, staring at the sharp line of her cheekbones, she'd wonder, what if someone saw something else in this face? But then she'd shut it down, fast. That kind of thinking was dangerous. Dreams were a luxury, and nobody had ever told Esther she was allowed luxury. One evening after a long shift, she was scrubbing the back kitchen when she overheard Mrs. Allison talking to someone just beyond the wall. People love a freak show, as long as it's at a distance. In real life, it just makes them uncomfortable. Esther, she could star in a horror movie, no makeup needed. Laughter, a woman's voice, maybe a supplier, maybe a guest. Esther gripped the wet rag tighter, her fingers going white. But she didn't walk out. She didn't say a word. She just kept wiping down the stove. The next morning, she walked to work like always. Same pink apron, same face, same 30 minutes of watching dust swirl along the roadside like it had nothing better to do. What she didn't know, not yet, was that the photo taken the day before had already made the rounds. Passed between truckers, pinned inside a motel guest book, eventually landing in the hands of someone who saw in her face not a punchline, but something else. Something harder to ignore. But she didn't know that. She just walked. Because even people trained to disappear still leave footprints behind, especially the ones who never speak, but refuse to break. And somewhere, miles away in a cheap motel lobby on the outskirts of Atlanta, the night was thick with silence. Only the low murmur of a TV played behind the front desk. A man just passing through on his way to Miami zipped up his suitcase. On the nightstand, he left behind a Polaroid photo, bent at the corners, a coffee ring on the edge. A woman, tired-eyed but fierce, standing behind a diner register. He'd snapped it for a joke, something to laugh at with his buddies. But he left it there, between the receipts and a pack of Winston Lights. 10 days later, the photograph landed on another continent, on the polished oak desk of a corner office tucked into Paris's Saint-Honoré district. The office, housed in a 19th century building, belonged to Alexandre Roux, creative director of Maison Roux, a man who, after 2 decades in fashion, had grown weary of polished sameness and learned to spot beauty that didn't beg for attention. He wasn't looking for a new face. There were already too many of those. Blank-eyed mannequins spinning down runways in perfect silence. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. The woman in the photo didn't ask to be liked. In her eyes there was defiance, pain, and something more. A quiet power that didn't need to prove itself. Alexandre stared at her like an archaeologist finding something ancient and real. No name. No return address. Just the motel logo on the envelope and a smudged guest signature on a check-in card his contact managed to track down. Within 3 days, through a chain of agents and favors, Alexandra was on the phone with the cafe owner in rural Georgia. The reply was blunt. If you're looking for that girl in the picture, you're too late. Just a waitress. Nothing special. He didn't buy it. He booked a flight. Masonville. Georgia was barely a town. 1 road, 2 gas stations, a church, a firehouse, a couple of diners, cornfields on the outskirts, an old cotton mill, and a cemetery perched on a sun-baked hill. Dust clung to everything. Your skin, your lungs, your memories. Time here didn't move, especially not for those born with dark skin and a ceiling set low. Gracie's Diner sat right off the highway next to a tired-looking tire shop. The neon sign buzzed even in broad daylight. Inside smelled like grease, stale coffee, and resignation. Esther Mary Hall worked 6 to 8, eyes down, hands steady. Every day the same. Wipe tables, pour coffee, take the jokes. sometimes crude, sometimes cruel, always with that slow southern drawl. She never answered. She spoke when necessary, moved fast, spoke less, gave nothing away. Mrs. Allison, the owner, was pushing 70, her pale eyes kind only when they were closed. She didn't encourage insults, but she never stopped them either. In her view, girls like that should be grateful for a job. You're all right, Essie, but people like to feel good, smile more, might even leave you a tip. Esther didn't smile. She saw no point. One afternoon just past noon, with the heat pressing down like a threat, the door creaked open and in walked a man. Tall, lean, dark sunglasses, crisp white shirt, French, Alexandre. His presence felt like a glitch in the town's dusty loop. He took a stool like anyone else, ordered coffee, but he didn't just glance at her. He studied her, not with curiosity, with intent, like he already knew. And then he pulled out the photograph. "Is this you?" he asked, his accent soft but unmistakable. Esther froze. Her chest tightened. Her first instinct was suspicion. That photo, forgotten, irrelevant, but she saw it and knew instantly. The counter, the angle, the smirking customer. Her fingers curled involuntarily, but she said nothing. Alexander's voice was low, calm. He introduced himself, told her who he was, showed her a card, said he'd flown from France. She listened, unmoved, thought this has to be a scam. Another trick. She'd met men like this. Big promises, small truths. He spoke of Paris, of runways, of a kind of beauty that didn't need explanation. Then he fell quiet and just waited. "I'm not a model," she finally said, eyes fixed on the floor. "That's exactly why I'm here," he said. He left his card and walked out. No pitch, no flattery, just a quiet statement. He'd be at the motel one more night. If she changed her mind, she could come by. No pressure, no games. When he paid, he left a tip that felt more like a message than money. Esther didn't sleep. That evening, she sat on the trailer's sagging front steps, watching the sun collapse behind the trees. Inside, her mother Rosa lay curled on the couch, her breathing shallow, her skin pale with effort. The meds were running out. The options were too. If she stayed, nothing would change. She'd age behind that counter, slowly wearing down like the tiles under her feet. But Paris, runways, that belonged to someone else's dream. She remembered the boys in school calling her a monkey, the teacher who once said girls like her shouldn't draw attention. She remembered her mother sewing until her fingers bled just so they could eat. Her father leaving, saying he couldn't take this life anymore. She didn't believe in fairy tales, which is why this felt dangerous. And yet the photo was real. The man was real. Late that night she walked. No makeup, plain t-shirt, hair tucked under a cap. She knocked on the motel door. Alexandra opened it instantly, as if he'd never gone to sleep. They talked for hours. She didn't ask about fame, just one thing. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing, just for you to show up." The next morning, the diner opened like always. But Esther wasn't there. Mrs. Allison muttered about girls disappearing like smoke. Someone joked she probably ran away from her own life. Someone else laughed, said, "With that face, Paris, that's a good one." But the world was shifting, slowly, like rain breaking a drought. And somewhere across the ocean, one photograph had already started cracking the surface of what had always been. The day started like 100 before it. Thick heat, the smell of fried oil and rot, peeling paint on the trailer walls, plastic cups stacked high in the sink. Silence broken only by a neighbor's radio and the cough of a dying woman. Esther made the bed, pulled the blanket over Rosa's legs, placed a bottle of water on the nightstand. She moved carefully, not waking her. Lately, her mother slept longer, barely moved, spoke less. Sometimes it seemed she no longer saw faces. But Esther did. And for the first time in years, She wondered if someone might finally be seeing hers. Esther didn't stop to question if she was doing the right thing by walking away. Not because she already knew, but because she was terrified of hearing the answer that might stop her in her tracks. Inside, a long brewing feeling had been growing, that life had always passed her by, like a train she never managed to catch. And now, for the first time, the train had come to a halt right at her own rusty platform. 5 days after Alexandre's visit, the letter arrived. A thick, padded envelope stamped with the fashion house's seal. Inside, a glossy brochure of portraits, a business card, and most startling, the plane ticket to Paris. Departure was set for Friday. Nothing around her felt real, except that everyone was telling the truth, and the ticket bore her name, Esther Mary Hall. No mistakes. As if someone, finally, had learned how to spell her name with care. She didn't speak a word all evening, said nothing to her mother, didn't ask for permission, because she already knew what Rosa would say. No, from fear, doubt, old wounds. She didn't blame her mother, but she couldn't stay either. That morning before leaving, she walked over to visit Mrs. Butler, the elderly neighbor in Trailer 4. A lone woman but kind, the one who brought soup for strength and helped keep track of pill bottles. Esther sank onto the old bench on her porch, the wood creaking beneath her, and without looking up said quietly, "I'm leaving. Could you stay with her for a little while?" Mrs. Butler didn't ask any questions. She simply nodded. "Do what you have to do. I'll take care of her. Everything will be all right." That day the diner buzzed with noise. A spilled cola, loud arguments about politics, the waitress Linda bawling out the cook over expired bacon. Esther stood behind the counter keeping an eye on the clock. 40 minutes left in her shift. She wiped the greasy surface of the bar one last time as customers ordered another cup, but not as strong as you. Nobody paid attention to her final glances. No one realized it was the last time she stood there. Not Mrs. Grace, not Linda, not the regulars. They saw her as furniture, a shadow behind the coffee machine. "Where you headed?" Linda called out when she spotted Esther stepping from the kitchen in a clean old dress instead of her work apron. "You're still got half an hour." Esther didn't answer. She pulled off her apron, folded it neatly, set it on the bar, and walked out. "Don't you dare crawl back here," Mrs. Grace yelled from behind her accounting papers. Esther didn't turn around. She didn't belong to this place anymore. The ride to Atlanta took almost 4 hours. The old bus reeked of sweat and fatigue, but she sat alone, clutching her battered duffel. Inside were 2 outfits, a few photos of her mother, some cash she'd saved over the past year and a half, and Alexander's letter, worn and read to tatters. She was flying for the first time. At the airport, she watched other passengers move through security, women in suits typing on laptops, families with kids laughing and fighting. She never felt like she belonged, but the fear was gone. It was like shedding old skin, the cracked, foreign shell. The plane was nearly empty. She took the window seat and watched as the fields of Georgia gave way to clouds, as the sun slipped down and darkness settled over the cabin. Not a word passed her lips. The flight attendant offered water. She said thanks, left the cup untouched. Her mind had already landed in Paris, somewhere unknown, somewhere new. Charles de Gaulle hit her with sudden cold and unfamiliar accents. In immigration, a young woman in a leather coat and cropped blonde hair held a tablet that read Esther Hall. She stepped forward before Esther could. "Bonjour, I'm Tilda from Alexandra." Her voice was steady, no pretense, no warmth. They drove off in a tinted window car. Paris blurred past like a souvenir postcard. Bridges, cafes, sirens, and rushing strangers. Esther felt distant as cratered glass in a window, like it was happening to someone else. Tilda brought her to a modest apartment in Saint Denis, far enough from the center to be quiet, close enough to be part of things. The space was bright, minimal. On the table, a bag of groceries. In the closet, new clothes, small sets ready-made for her. No questions, no explanations. Just, first meeting at the agency is tomorrow. Rest now. Then Tilda was gone, and Esther was left alone. Sleep didn't come easy. She lay in bed with her eyes shut. But as hours ticked by, she realized just how alien this world felt. No Georgia clay under her fingernails. No shouts from the diner kitchen. No mother moaning on the couch. Just unfamiliar walls and eerie silence. When rain began tapping the glass at dawn, she rose and pressed her forehead against the window, and for the first time since leaving, felt a tight knot in her throat. But she didn't cry. She stood there until daylight. In the morning, the agency awaited in a grand old building on the Seine's banks. Floor-to-ceiling windows, galleries on the walls, the scent of coffee mixed with hairspray. French assistants with cold faces, stylish men in heeled shoes, women who looked cut from magazine pages. They stared at her with undisguised confusion, some with outright scorn. One even whispered, "C'est une blague? Is this a joke?" But then Alexandre appeared, silencing the murmurs with a subtle gesture. He looked at Esther as if she were the standard. No deviation, no apology. "This is not a joke," he said. "This is our new reality." In that moment, Esther realized there was no going back. Paris welcomed her with damp air and a biting wind that sliced through her coat, as if even the atmosphere here rejected outsiders. Maison Rue stood in a historic building in the 3rd arrondissement. Tall arched windows, marble staircase, walls adorned with paintings by lesser-known but expensive artists. Every detail inside whispered, "You don't belong here." Esther didn't speak. They brought her in a black car with tinted windows, through a side entrance, past guards, assistants, and receptionists. She was ushered straight to a fitting room, where someone handed her a uniform. Black turtleneck, tailored pants, and low-heeled shoes. Only when she was fully dressed did Alexandre Roux finally appear. He walked up slowly, nodded without a smile, and said quietly, "You don't adjust to the world. The world adjusts to you." But Esther didn't believe that. Not here. She didn't speak French, didn't understand the gestures or the stares, and the stares were constant. Each person who passed her looked, not at her eyes, not at her outfit, but at her face, like it didn't belong in the building. Their expressions said it all: confusion, disapproval, discomfort. A face that didn't fit the mold, a shape that bent the line. No one really explained anything those first few days. Stylists took turns tugging at her hair, twisting strands, muttering to each other in French. "Trop sauvage," one whispered. "Too wild." Makeup artists layered foundation over her skin like they were trying to erase something, to smooth out the truth and paint over it with something more acceptable, always 2 shades too light. One of the younger ones smirked and said, "She looks like a tribal statue." Esther said nothing, just watched. She tracked everything, the glances, the tones, the words she didn't understand but could feel anyway. Her silence wasn't fear, it was discipline. She'd learned to keep her fire locked up since childhood. Her rebellion wasn't in what she said, it was in what she did. Tilda Monet arrived on the 3rd day, tall with cropped silver hair and a cigarette always nearby. She didn't walk into the room, she claimed it. A woman who wore time like a badge, not a burden. She'd marched in Paris in '68 and styled runways for Saint Laurent. She glanced at Esther and, without a word, brushed aside the assistant holding a folder full of looks. "They don't get it," she said softly, almost to herself. But her eyes were on Esther. "You're not an object. You're a statement." From that moment, everything changed. Tilda took her in like an artist takes in raw clay. She demanded a private dressing room. "Someplace we can think," she said, and stripped off the synthetic wig they'd already tried to glue to Esther's head. She wiped away the cake makeup and stared for a long time. Not as a fashion expert, as a woman looking at another woman. "There's no ugliness in you," she said. her voice calm and even. There's pain, and you don't hide it. That's what makes you beautiful. They worked day and night, not for the runway, but for Esther herself. Walk, posture, eye contact, not poses, presence, confidence. Tilda didn't want a model. She wanted a person. At first, Esther didn't understand why. Who was she to deserve this kind of attention? But every day, her hands shook a little less. And every morning, her reflection felt less like a target and more like someone with purpose. The clothes they picked out for her never worked. Everything felt like it was trying to hide her instead of show her. Designers offered silks and sleek lines. Tilda scoffed at them. Number, you're not silk, you're cotton. Cotton lives closer to the skin. You'll wear raw seams because your life hasn't been smooth. You won't play pretend. You'll be you. And so they built something new, a simple black dress. No glitter, no drama, no unnecessary frills. A wide neckline that drew the eye to her jaw and collarbones. The fabric, rough, textured, almost industrial, looked like it was cut from a worker's uniform, but the tailoring turned it into armor. In her hands, she carried black leather gloves, the kind worn by factory women. This wasn't a costume. It was a declaration, I'm not an accident. The final rehearsal was the night before the show. Esther walked last, not because she'd earned it, but because Rue insisted. He wanted her to close the show. Many weren't happy, especially one of the senior designers, a pale man in his 50s, who muttered just loud enough, she's not a model, she's a charity project. She heard him, understood enough of the words to feel the weight of them. Tilda stepped in, not quietly, not in private, in the hallway, in front of everyone. She's got more taste in one step than your last 30 dresses combined, she snapped. She's not your checkbox. She's your line in the sand. Watch it shift. That night, Esther couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her tiny model dorm, staring at a neon sign across the street, the red glow buzzing like it was alive. The words spun in her head. Ugly, wild statue. But underneath those, something else had taken root. You're not an object. You're a statement. And for the first time in a long while, there was no fear in her, just clarity. She wasn't walking out there tomorrow to be accepted. She was walking out there simply to be. That was enough. Paris, March 1984. A gray, bitter morning, with wind curling like knives down the narrow streets of the 3rd arrondissement. Inside an old textile factory-turned-fashion venue, time bent. The world outside didn't exist. In here, there were only lights, flashes, whispering fabrics, and the tense hush of backstage moments before a show. Georgia was gone. The trailer, the diner grease, her mother's couch, and the stale smell of burnt eggs. None of that was here, but it all still lived in her, in how she walked, how she held herself, not with pride, not with defiance, just with truth. Head not high, head steady. Backstage felt like a war camp before battle. Dozens of hands fluttered around the models, adjusting seams, dabbing makeup, pinning stray threads. The air was thick with perfume, hairspray, nerves, and fabric. Black curtains muted the space, and mirrors flashed back only fragments, faces sliced by light, silhouettes unfinished, like the truth was too much to show all at once. Esther sat before the mirror, silent. Her eyes didn't dart around the room. She wasn't looking for approval. She was looking at herself, not with awe, not with doubt, with certainty, as if memorizing every feature, just in case it all vanished. Tilda stood behind her, holding the final pieces of her look. The dress, long, heavy, the color of smoke and ash, looked like something refashioned from a waitress's uniform, but sculpted with angles and shadows that turned it into art. On the chest, barely visible, hand-stitched in silver thread, were the words, "We serve," the phrase from her old diner apron. Not a shame. A root. "You're ready," Tilda said simply. "No drama, not as a teacher, as a witness." Esther nodded, not because she felt brave. Bravery wasn't the point. She had already made her decision long ago. Backstage was dark. The audience rustled. Shutters snapped. Magazine editors whispered to each other. The runway director murmured into his headset. And a few yards away, Alexandra Rose stood perfectly still, tailored blazer, notebook in hand, cigarette dangling loose. He said nothing, just watched. There wasn't pride in his gaze, as if he'd discovered someone. It was something deeper, someone who'd seen something stronger than themselves. Maybe for the first time. Then the lights came up, the beat kicked in, slow drums colliding with electric chords, and the show began. Model after model stepped out, flawless in timing, each wearing more than clothes, an idea. But the audience didn't yet know what was about to land in the finale. Maison Rue always pulled surprises, but tonight, no one expected this. Behind the curtain, Esther counted her breaths. She didn't pray, didn't replay rehearsals. She remembered instead her mother's tired face, the sticky diner floor, tray crumbs, the smell of coffee mixed with sweat, the sneers that weren't funny. And that day, the Frenchman walked in and said, "I want that look." When the coordinator whispered her name, she stepped forward. The runway was long, the lights cut sharp, the crowd melted into shadows. She couldn't see faces, just a steady mass of humanity, like at the diner. But here they had to look at her. No downward glances, no whispered jokes, straight at her. With every step, her heels reminded her of backbone. The dress pulled like it tried to slow her, but she kept walking, back straight, shoulders smooth, chest forward, not in defiance, just because her body didn't apologize anymore. She reached the end, turned, paused. Flashbulbs exploded, blinding white. Cameras reached toward her like greedy hands. But there was no laughter, no one searching for flaw. They were looking for story, and the story was standing right there. When she stepped backstage again, she was met with silence. Stylists, assistants, models, Alexandra, even a TV cameraman from French television, were frozen. The first applause rolled in, gentle at first, then louder. The murmur of chairs scraping filled the air as people stood. And then, full roar, ovation. But Esther did not smile, did not cry. Her face stayed still. Only her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment. 2 hours later, after the chaos quieted, only a few things remained in the dressing room. Her dress, a glossy magazine featuring her portrait on the cover, and a note from Tilda. "You no longer serve. Now you are." She stepped out into the drizzle. The building's banners shielded her from the sky's wet, but photographers, couriers, and editors clustered at the exit. Some smoked, others spoke into phones, but she walked forward, past them, without fanfare, without pause. No one stopped her. She had already become part of history, but she didn't stay. A week later, her face was on 3 covers: Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and L'Officiel. Show photos splashed across global pages under headlines: "The new face of fashion, power and honesty, the silent revolution." But Esther didn't do a single interview, not one. She didn't explain why she chose to walk, didn't describe her feelings, didn't talk about herself. Because her silence spoke louder than any words. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't want those who'd mocked her to feel guilt. She wanted something simpler, never again to need anyone's permission, to be, to look people in the eye, to step forward without asking. A little over 2 months had passed since that first runway walk in Paris. In that short time, her face had become recognizable, not just among fashion insiders, but even among those who'd once laughed. Covers, interviews, shoots, press meetings, now part of her daily routine. But today, she wasn't on set. wasn't backstage. Today she was back in Georgia. No cameras, no security, no entourage. Just a small bag in one hand and a stack of magazines in the other. The kind of stack handed to you by Alexander's assistant before the flight. Georgia's sun was harsher than Paris's. The air was heavy, and dust stuck to her leather sandals. Same heat, same despair in the faces at the gas station where she stopped for water. No one recognized her right away. She wiped off her makeup, let down her hair, swapped her runway dress for a simple cotton one. She wanted quiet, not because she was tired of recognition, but because she didn't need it anymore. The bus from Atlanta wound down old highways, through towns where time had puddled and gone limp. Windows stayed boarded, elders rocked on porches, young folks languished near repair shops. America hadn't changed here. She stepped off in her old neighborhood. The asphalt cracked beneath her feet, the air thick with dust and heat. The road to the trailer park burned through memory, and her chest tightened, knowing she'd passed by the diner. It looked the same. The faded facade, the worn sign, the squeaky door, smudged windows. Through the glass, she saw Mrs. Allison. Same pale hair, same apron, same tired expression. Two men sat at the counter, over 50, in ball caps and flannel shirts. One ate eggs, the other skimmed the local paper. Their eyes inadvertently lifted. One man paused mid-bite. Eyebrows rose. He nodded to his friend. The other turned. A moment of recognition. Silence in their conversation. They stared, unmoving. But she kept walking. Didn't slow. Didn't look at the door. Didn't stop to say one word. She didn't want to. Not out of pride, but something deeper and heavier. Inside, there was nothing left needing validation from these people. Everything that once burned, scorched, humiliated, had burnt away. Now it was just memory, and memories had no power over her anymore. She reached her mother's trailer just before sundown. The air was thick, the kind that sticks to your skin and carries the smell of rust and memory. From next door, Miss June appeared, full-figured, white woman, short gray hair, wearing a knitted robe and house slippers. She stepped off her porch like she'd been waiting there all day. "Oh, my lord, Esther, is that really you?" she said, voice soft with disbelief. "I saw you on TV, and in that magazine. My grandson's got your picture pinned on his wall. Can you believe that?" Esther gave a small nod. No words. Miss June opened her arms halfway but stopped herself. She felt something in the air, something sacred about this moment, and didn't cross the line. Instead, she said gently, "She's on the porch. She's been waiting, every evening, like she knew you'd come." Esther walked past her. Her mother sat in an old metal lawn chair, eyes on the horizon. The sun melted behind the trees, leaving streaks of gold across the sky. Her gray hair was tied back low, hands thin, veined, resting on her lap. She wore a lilac dress, homemade, patched together from scraps years ago. Faded now, but still holding the shape of something once stitched with care. Her back was slightly curved, but her face, those sharp cheekbones, the steady stare, looked exactly the same. Weathered not by age, but by years of surviving. "You came back," she said simply. No surprise, no praise, no blame. Just fact. Esther nodded again and sat beside her. They didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, like they were both listening to something bigger than words. After a while, Esther pulled a magazine from her bag. The cover showed her in that Maison Rue gown, posture proud, eyes unflinching. The caption read, "The face that changed fashion." She handed it to her mother. The old woman took it carefully, studied it, not quickly, not sentimentally, just deeply, then looked at her daughter. "They probably say you're beautiful now, don't they?" Esther didn't answer, just kept her gaze forward. Her mother nodded, like she already knew. "You always were. They just didn't know how to see it." They sat that way for a long time. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. A pickup rumbled down the road, trailing dust. Esther leaned back, her elbow resting on the old porch railing. The wood still splintered like she remembered. Her mother never asked about Paris, or the shows, or the money. She just said one thing: "You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're alive, and that they didn't break you." They stayed on the porch until the dark settled in. No more words, just air and memory. Later, Esther unrolled a blanket on the same lumpy couch she used to sleep on as a kid. The house still smelled like it used to: old tobacco, laundry soap, and sunlight filtering through dusty curtains. She lay down, staring at the ceiling. No thoughts, no plans, just breathe. The next day, she passed the diner again, this time in broad daylight, when the place was full. A group of guys sat out front, laughing too loud, sipping sweet tea. One of them looked up, squinted. He recognized her, nudged his buddy. Another reached for his phone. Someone whispered something. Esther didn't stop, didn't smile, didn't flinch. She just walked, head high, shoulders loose, calm, not with pride, not with revenge, just presence, like someone who no longer needed to be seen to know who she was. Sometimes people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to tell them it's okay to be themselves, to say you're worthy, to hand them permission, open the door, nod them forward. But in places like that small-town diner in Georgia, permission doesn't come. You're tested. You're worn down. They wait to see if you'll crack. But if you don't, you've already won. Esther never begged to be loved. She didn't plead for anyone to believe in her. She just kept going, step by step, past the ones who laughed, past the ones who stayed silent, past the ones who looked right through her. Because at some point she understood, no one's obligated to see your light until you light it yourself. And sometimes that little flame is enough, not just for you, but for the girl watching from a distance, in her own small town, in her own quiet war, wondering if she matters. And when she sees you, really sees you, she might think, maybe I can too. And that's what makes it all worth it. For the quiet ones, the waiting ones, the almost broken but not quite ones. Just remember this: you don't need anyone's permission to begin living your real life. You already have the right, just by being here. And if this story stirred something in you, stick around. There are more stories like this one. Stories about strength, about survival, about finally choosing yourself. The kind of story that one day might just change your life too.